All right. Hi, good afternoon or good morning, wherever you are. Welcome to our NCME webinar series for 2022. In this webinar series, we're focusing on diversity, equity, and inclusion in assessment practices. We have planned a total of 4 webinars, and we're on number 3 right now. We started off with the series on a general session around all the different assessments and practices. And then last week, we had a session devoted to admission selection exam. Today, we get to talk about credentialing exams. We have 4 very experienced panelists who's going to share their experiences in this area. And then next week, we're going to close off the webinar series by focusing on K-12 assessment and DEI practices in those assessments. We typically start off our webinar series by introductions of who's be speaking today. So my name is Tong. I am Senior Vice President of Assessment Operations with the National Board of Medical Examiners. The type of assessments we focus on at NBME are medical licensure exams, as well as exams that support medical education for undergraduate and graduate medical schools. I will be one of the facilitators today, and I'm going to turn over to Susan.
Hi, I'm Susan Davis-Becker. I'm a partner and psychometrician with ACS Ventures. And I have the fortunate opportunity to be involved some with K-12 assessments, and then also a lot with credentialing assessments. So I'm very excited for this opportunity to, in a webinar series like this, to kind of learn lessons from both sides. So thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Susan. Let's go to our panelist for introduction, Carol.
Hey, I acknowledge that I am on the traditional lands of the Piscataway and Nacotchtank peoples. According to the officials at the National Museum of the American Indian, there is no living Nacotchtank lineage left. Their numbers were decimated and survivors were adopted into the Piscataway people. I'm located in Arlington, Virginia. I'm Carol Ezzelle, Senior Director of Psychometrics at the National Board for Professional Teaching Standards. My pronouns are she, her. The National Board awards certification of accomplished teaching. And in order to receive National Board certification, an educator or candidate must have completed at least 3 years of full-time teaching and be successful on a performance-based assessment. Our assessment has 4 components. One is computer-based and is comprised of multiple choice and essay items. And there are 3 portfolio components that require various evidence, which include, but aren't limited to, student work samples that show growth as a result of differentiated instruction, 2 classroom videos that show the candidate engaging with and positively impacting students, and evidence of the use of student data and of professional learning to positively impact student learning. So for each portfolio, the candidate also provides a written commentary and reflection on the evidence that they submit. So that is just a snapshot of what educators do to demonstrate accomplished teaching and earn National Board certification. I'm very grateful to be part of this series.
Grateful to have you too. Let's go to Jared.
Hello, everybody. My name is Jared Zurn. I am a licensed architect, and I now work on the licensure exam for architects all across the United States. And so basically my bio is I've been at this for a long time. When I actually wrote this all down, 32 years where I've actually been directly engaged either studying or practicing architecture. I've been licensed myself for 15. And I came into this test publisher world about 13 years ago. And before that, I was an educator in the area. So, but I did write down forever, I'm always willing to ask the hard questions. And that's what we want to do today, is we want to challenge you a little bit to think about what you're doing, how you're thinking about diversity, equity, and inclusion in your exam. As I said, I am an architect, and I went through the architecture process. And our process today is similar to what Carol outlined. There's an educational component. Most Licensed architects do get a NAB accredited degree, so it's an accreditation for the degree program on top of the regionally accredited thing the university has already gone through. NAB degrees at a minimum are 5 years. Many are now 4+2 degrees, so they come out with a master's in architecture to earn their license or start the path to licensure. There is an experience requirement. It typically takes people a couple, like 3 years to complete the experience requirement. It's broken down into 6 different content areas where they have to document a certain amount of experience in each area. And then there is, of course, the exam, which is what I work on. And our exam is also a 6-part exam. So nobody gets to pass just one test. We make you pass 6, and it totals about 25 hours of assessment time.
It's amazing.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mihaiela Gugiu, and I am the Director of Psychometrics and Analytics at the National Registry of Emergency Medical Technicians. The National Registry is the nation's certification organization of emergency medical services, or EMS providers, and it offers 4 certification examinations at 4 different levels: emergency medical responders, emergency medical technicians, advanced emergency medical technicians, and paramedic. And we have both computerized adaptive testing and linear, fixed linear examinations. And for 2 of our examinations, the advanced emergency medical technicians and paramedic, we have both a cognitive computer-based testing and a psychomotor examination. In my capacity, I'm overseeing the development and validation of examinations, and I am also a member of the organization's Diversity and Inclusion Task Force. And it is a pleasure to be here today.
Thank you. And Buck.
Hello, everyone. I'm Buck Chafee. I'm the president of the Caviar group. We're a certification and testing consulting company, and we help create licensure and certification exams for a number of different professions, including medicine, finance, corporate directors, design, engineering, and interpreting, both sign language and voice interpreting. We do examinations around the world, 120 countries, 18 languages, and we do all kinds of exams. We do traditional multiple choice, we do high-level professional judgment, and those kind of exams, as well as performance exams where the person actually has to produce something or actually has to appear in response to certain stimuli, and then have human grading. So I've been doing this for 40 years, and throughout that time, we have been dealing with the same kind of issues. We didn't call them what we call them today, but we've been dealing with the same problems of how do you make sure that your program isn't biased for or against any group of people based on any characteristics that are beyond the characteristics you really care about, which is knowledge, skill, and ability. So that's what we do. Nice to see you all.
So thanks again to our presenters for being here. And what we tried to do was get a broad range of programs represented, as you could hear from their bios and the types of programs they work with. But also we reached out to folks who were excited to talk about this topic. And as Buck mentioned, like excited to talk about kind of some current perspectives. What are programs thinking about? What are they trying? We know that not anyone has all of the solutions, but we're hoping here to explore just ways to look at this topic, and then also solutions that programs are trying out. So as a format for this session, we've put together 2 key questions we ask each of our presenters to respond to. They've prepared some advanced thoughts on that. We're going to go through those, and then we're going to dive into some Q&A. So if you have questions along the way, drop them into the chat. We'll circle back. They can either be related to what a presenter has said, or even bigger picture questions. We welcome them all. So we're going to start with our first question here. We asked our presenters to share a little bit about how the topics of diversity, equity, and inclusiveness are being addressed in the professions you represent. And then how is your credentialing program looking into these topics? So just as a start. And I think we are starting with Jared.
Great. Well, thank you, Susan. And as I said, so I've been in this architecture world now for 30 some years. So you have to acknowledge that I think I'm turning into an old white guy talking to you about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And they've got to be honest about that. Like, that is the first thing I'm going to tell you. Like, when you start talking about this topic, you've got to be honest about who you are, right? So I'm not going to show up somewhere and pretend to not be exactly what I am. I am somebody who was born in Minnesota. I learned architecture. I started practicing back in that state. And I didn't really leave Minnesota until I moved to Virginia to work for the National Council of Architectural Registration Boards. And honestly, for the first 20 some years of my career, nobody was talking about diversity, equity, inclusion in architecture. It just wasn't a topic. Everybody was just talking about how great architects are because we're a bunch of architects and we love to talk about how great we are to each other. Like, that's the reality of the profession. And so over the last 5 years, it really has changed. And so that's one of the realities that is sort of front and center for NCARB. And so I just some quick snippets I put on this slide for you. The first thing is you have to understand it's a license to practice architecture. This is a yes/no decision. You are an architect, which means you hold a license to practice, or you are not an architect. And so I don't care if you've been working in the industry for 40 years, if you don't have a license, if you call yourself an architect, you get in trouble. And so we also have to confront the reality that in our profession, it is a yes/no decision. Even if you are an active employee working in an architectural firm and contributing to the profession, the title is protected from a regulatory perspective. And I think that really matters. Okay, so now the first highlight I put on here was AIA, the American Institute of Architects, the leading professional society for architects all across this country, recently hired a new chief executive officer. She began her, contract with AIA just 1 month ago at the beginning of February. And this is her quote: "On the biggest challenge currently facing the profession, it's justice, belonging, and access. It has been called out as the #1 issue for our profession as a whole." This is not a surprising comment to me because we have been talking about this in architecture for the last several years about why does architecture look like me and why doesn't architecture look more like society as a whole in this country. So that's like, I'll tell you, there's 2 big issues in architecture right now. 1 is diversity, equity, inclusion, and 2 is how do we address the aspects of the changing climate. That's all. Those are the 2 hot topics, I will tell you. And if you want to talk about something else, sure, but it's going to cycle back to one of those 2 issues. I'm just being honest. Okay, so then let's go. What does Google think, right? Because this is always a fun thing. I suggest everybody does it in your profession. What does the internet actually think about your profession? Because I know you probably think it's great, but what do other people think? So I did this. I'm not kidding. This was my first search. Is architecture a diverse industry? And of course, what does Google tell me? Architecture remains very much a white profession, right? So again, Google is saying this, right? Which honestly, that's perception. And so even I can tell you, I have all kinds of data. The current graduates of those NAB accredited degree programs I talked about, they are much more diverse than they've ever been in history. But the reality is that's the pipeline in the profession. It's not the profession of people that have been around for 20 or 30 years and are going to probably be around for another 10 or 15 years, right? And so it's the pipeline in is much smaller than the population that exists in architecture. So I think it's critical to understand that even as you want to make change, change does not happen overnight because you're trying to change history, right? You're overcoming what has been the history, and that's our role in these regulatory systems. So what are we doing about it? I will tell you the first thing we're doing is we're being transparent about what our programs are telling us. And so you can go on the web, you can come to the NCARB website. We have a publication called NCARB by the Numbers, and we put it out every year for the last 10 years. And we tell you all the data we have about the people on the path to licensure and the people that have gotten licensed in the last year and the people that are still in the profession. And there's that little, and it's really super small, and I know that, and I probably did that on purpose because I didn't want to get too much into the details. That little bar chart that you see there in green is us telling you all publicly the pass rates of each of our 6 exams broken down by race, and gender and ethnicity. And I will tell you, you notice the bars go up and down quite a bit with that black line. So the black line is the national average. So if you look at the national average, you're like, oh, that's not bad. But what you will start to notice if you zoom in on it is that the little bar that's always above the black line. Yeah, that's white males. White males pass on the national average much higher than everybody else and consistently. White females pass most of the time a little bit better than the national average. And as you can start to maybe guess, other populations do not. And some certainly pass at a much lower rate. We are publicly talking about a 30% disparity between white males passing our various divisions of our exam compared to women of color. And that is a conversation that needs to be had. So what do? Right now, we're just trying to highlight the evidence. Because do I have all the answers? No, I do not have all the answers. If you thought you were going to get them all in this webinar, I apologize in advance. What we're going to do is talk to you about what we can do. And step number one is just being honest about what's really going on in the industry. And that's what we're doing.
Thanks, Jared. All right, now we're going to turn to Mihaiela.
Thank you. So the National Registry of EMTs has been around for just over half a century. And during this period of time, the profile of an EMS provider, emergency medical services provider, has changed, but only slightly. However, when we are talking about issues of diversity, equity, and inclusiveness, it's really important for us to understand what's the makeup of the stakeholder population that we are serving, we're certifying, and especially what's the comparison with the general population, which is the ultimate stakeholder for us. So based on recent data published in 2020, 2/3 of the EMS providers, if you could advance to the next slide, please. Thank you. 2/3 of the EMS providers self-identify as male, whereas in the general population, based on data from the US Census, we see that just slightly under 50% of the population actually self-identify as male. When it comes to racial ethnic identity, over 80% of the EMS providers self-identify as non-Hispanic whites, where in the general population, we have just 60% of the population which self-identifies as non-Hispanic white. But these two sets of slides highlight is a very homogeneous EMS provider population that is not representative of the general makeup of the US population they serve. So what is the response? What should we do? In the summer of 2020, the National Registry became very intentional in its approach to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and it did that in two ways. So one of them is external, outward facing via the Inclusion, Diversity, Equity, and Access Task Force, and the other one is inward facing via the Diversity and Inclusion Task Force. So the Inclusion, Diversity, Equity, and Access Task Force is a task force that is led by the National Registry. Could you advance the next slide, please? Yeah. Thank you. And is a collaborative group, really, of willing participants from representative stakeholder organization in the EMS industry, who are such position as they can operate at some strategic and structural level where they could remove some barriers, policy or practice barriers, especially if they work together. So the way the IDEA task force works is that the task force identifies a problem and proposes a solution, and then asks the organization which is in a position to maybe address that problem to implement the solution. So I will give you two examples of some of these acts that they were able to actually accomplish since 2020. One of them has to do with the next one, the appeals policy. And the IDEA task force asked the National Registry's Board of Directors to change the policy that were requiring applicants to who have been denied the ability to sit for an examination to present themselves in person for an appeals hearing in Columbus, Ohio, where the organization has its headquarters. And instead, it allowed them to do this via Zoom or other video conferencing avenues. This was done successfully in 2020, and then it was translated into a permanent policy change. And the other was related to a recommendation that was made to the Committee on Accreditation of EMS Professions, which to require paramedic education programs to collect demographic data on students and report it in their annual accreditation reports. Currently, it is not possible to determine the makeup of the student population who enters and potentially leave or complete the paramedic programs because we don't have that kind of information. We know how many are certified or registered to certify, but that's already too late. We don't have information about the pipeline, as Jared was mentioning. So the request was approved, and information actually they start collecting that this year. The other thing that IDEA was able to do is to create a website where they put various resources and they make them available to the community, to the educators, to employers, to practitioners, to potential candidates. And they bring all these different resources with a focus on diversity, equity, and inclusiveness. And lastly, the last thing I want to mention is that they established a professional learning community where once per month, they invite a speaker and they bring the EMS community who is interested, anyone who is interested on issues of diversity, equity, and inclusiveness can join and ask questions, learn, and discuss different issues and learn from others in the community. Internally, at the same time, there was created a diversity and inclusion task force. And this was established really by volunteer staff who are committed to create a diverse, inclusive workplace. And the way to do that was, well, first we have to assess how the staff feel that we are doing, where we are in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusiveness. And that was achieved via a cultural assessment survey. And the findings of those surveys were used to identify areas of opportunity and things that we should be focusing on the D&I task force in order to change things in the organization. It also, we created an internal page where staff were presented with various resources on diversity and inclusion topics. And they were also encouraged to adopt a gender inclusive language. And we worked with the IT department to help anyone who was interested to add pronouns after their signatures and after their email signatures. And the other thing that I want to emphasize is we also created this monthly contagious conversation series where we bring staff together, whomever is interested, to discuss a variety of topics that may be too sensitive to discuss otherwise, and do this in a safe environment. And finally, we required everyone in the organization to go and undergo an implicit bias training. And that was one of the things, the only thing that the D&I task force was able to do that was a requirement. Everything else was optional, and staff were participating if they wanted or not. Thank you.
Apologies there. I'll turn this over to Buck.
Okay, thank you. And Clarence is the official name, so if you get confused, that's why it's different. But yeah, so we actually have a slightly different role than many of the other participants in that we don't represent any profession itself. We serve a lot of professions. So our job is not to try to improve any given profession, but to act as the credentialing agent for those professions. And as such, our real job is to protect the people who get the services from the professionals. So our clients, if you will, are ultimately the consumers of professional services. And in doing so, our role in terms of obligation to the candidates is to ensure that nothing comes between our ability to assess the quality and qualifications of a candidate that isn't supposed to be there, that isn't knowledge, skill, or ability of the job that's being described. So basically what we're talking about is any form of bias. And while you can talk about race and gender and age and all those sex and those things, there are many, many more forms of bias that are actually much more subtle and much more difficult to assess. In fact, you can't really count them. Bias such as what group do you belong to? Not group in terms of demographic group, but group in terms of like a cultural group. What team do you belong to? What class do you belong to? What you find is if your people who are preparing the exam are in one set and the people taking the exam are in multiple sets, those don't always jive. In other words, they describe the profession the way they see it. And if you're not careful, you get a small group of professionals describing the exam or the profession the way it is in their club. In other words, it's a small group of people defining the profession. You can't have that because that's not the real definition of the profession. That's perhaps an elitist definition that you have to be really careful for. So in any case, our role is to look for bias across the board in every aspect of what we do. And in doing that, interestingly, we give exams where the vast majority of the candidates are white. We give exams where the vast majority of the candidates are Black, vast majority male, vast majority female, vast majority hearing, vast majority deaf. We give all of these things, so we can't really just say we're going to increase a certain population, a certain count, because that really doesn't do it for us. What we have to do is make sure that we go beyond just those surface factors and really get into, is this whole profession being defined? Is it all being determined by a subgroup of people? Or is it really being determined by all of the people, and especially the consumers, and what is it that they expect and they need out of the profession? So when we do a survey, for example, a job task analysis, we don't just survey a small population, we survey the consumers. What's their expectation? And a lot of times that doesn't jive with what the small group of people that you might have as your subject matter experts defines as the profession. So in any case, we look at it in a much broader perspective and look at it from a lot of different angles.
And Carol.
Okay, so how many of us, after seeing Jared's slide, went to Google and typed in, is insert profession a diverse profession? I'll admit that I did. The profession that I'm representing is teaching. See, I knew other people did. And it turns out that, as expected, what comes up first is that nationally there's over 50% students of color, and yet 80% of teachers are white. And this is the part that's really hard to swallow. About 40% of public schools don't have a single teacher of color. That's problematic. Now, in terms of promoting DEI in the teaching profession, given current events, you may be aware that in the teaching profession, the topics of DEI are being addressed by focusing on how do you create more equitable learning environments? How do you give students multiple ways of creating and engaging in sharing and learning, regardless of ability, income, language, location, or identity? Now, teachers are provided with professional learning, at least here in the bubble, Arlington, Virginia. And they may even have mandated training requirements, and other efforts geared towards inclusivity could include social emotional learning programs, parent communication tools, and programs focused on English language learners. The problem is, one problem is that, example, according to Ed Week Market Brief, curriculum materials for teachers that are the materials that are currently on the market really fall short when it comes to representing people of color and providing guidance for teachers on how to address diversity and inclusiveness. The biggest weakness is that materials aren't providing teachers enough support. How do I address these topics? And then there's the fact that people of color are either diminished or missing entirely from historical references and stories. And certainly there is variability across school districts and how much effort is being put into promoting DEI. The same Ed Week brief stated that, quote, a strong majority of the district administrators, school principals, and teachers who were surveyed, 72%, say their districts are putting at least some effort into promoting DEI. Well, that 72% leaves a whopping nearly 30% who did not indicate what level of effort their district is putting into promoting DEI. Do we assume zero effort? At the National Board, we have been working to understand the equity issues and barriers to National Board certification in 3 areas. Looking at our standards for accomplished teaching and the assessment, looking at advocacy and awareness of the certification, and also looking at how our candidates experience the journey of certification. We have known that time and money have been the 2 largest challenges that our candidates face when completing certification. And earlier, I described the assessment, 4 components, 3 of them portfolio-based. In 2015, National Board reduced the fees, and now the total is just under $2,000. And how many hours do you think it takes an educator to complete this assessment? Self-reported data shows a median of 50 hours is spent by candidates on each of the 3 portfolio components alone. And as you can imagine, time and money are not in abundance for teachers, much less for minoritized teachers. Now, the National Board has developed payment plans. We encourage scholarships and state and district funded incentives. Internally, we have efforts that are focusing on staff development. We have our own staff DEI task force. We focus on our hiring procedures. The majority of our board of directors are individuals of color and/or Indigenous peoples. We've also included on our website our commitment to DEI and anti-racism. And part of it states that we believe educators must help students understand their role in a diverse world, value individual differences, and especially in times like these, we believe in the power of the teaching profession to defend what is good and right for all people. That's just where I'm going to start off in terms of how we're trying to promote diversity in accomplished teaching certification. In a few minutes, I'll share some more concrete examples of the way we promote it.
Fantastic. As we were listening to the different types of conversations various organizations are having, I think we're all seeing some common themes throughout, and that certainly are not, these are certainly very complicated conversations, but I'm glad to see that we're calling it what it is and then trying to figure out what we can do as a profession to help continue to push for the envelope. When we set up this webinar series, we really wanted to talk about specific issues within a given types of assessment, because a different type of assessment also have their unique aspects, challenges, opportunities, so to speak, related to DEI practices in assessment. And with credentialing exams, and I think we've heard from our panelists earlier, there are 2 aspects to this. One is we are providing licensure certification to individuals who then potentially go into professions and be able to practice. And on the other hand, we're also serving as a protection for the consumers who are then going to use those services from the certified licensed professionals. So there are different aspects to the credentialing exams. And that's why some of these practices also make it the opportunities very challenging, unique. One of the things we also wanted to really look into with these webinar series is to talk about yes, we do agree this is very important. We definitely need to have these discussions and think about what we can do. But we also want to make it a little bit more concrete and think through what are the things currently different organizations are engaged in to be able to do something about this. So our next part of the conversations are going to focus on what solutions the programs are currently doing or exploring in terms of implementation, from program design, perspective development, administration scoring, and monitoring maintenance. So we're gonna go through all the 4 panelists, and then we'll have some Q&A at the end. So Mihaiela, I'm gonna turn it over to you.
Thank you, Ian. So like probably every other program, we at the National Registry are using a multi-pronged approach where we are thinking about and designing our examinations. And I would say that very importantly, some of the things I'm going to talk about, they really started, prior to 2020, the events that galvanized communities across the country and the world, but which did bring a more sustained focus to issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So one of the things which also Bach mentioned was practice analysis. So in 2019, we did a practice analysis for 2 of our examinations, the advanced life support, the advanced emergency medical technicians and paramedic levels, and we looked to incorporate additional data points in the practice analysis besides the traditional focus groups and survey of providers. So for this practice analysis, we also first looked at concrete data on EMS runs from the National Emergency Medical Services Information System, and based on that, supplemented with focus groups and surveys of EMS providers. And the link there is really to the publication that we have, and which is an open access, where you can see a summary of the methodology that was employed in the 2019 practice analysis. Currently, we are also doing the practice analysis for the other 2 levels, the basic life support examinations, where we are adding additional data points via observations of EMS runs and semi-structured interviews with EMS providers, in addition to the objective data of EMS runs from the National Emergency Medical Services Information System, and focus groups and surveys. So we are trying to touch as many points and get as many data points, many different perspectives when we are designing and getting information about practice analysis, which serves as the foundation for our examinations. The other thing that we have been paying attention to for at least 4.5 years since I've been with the National Registry is with regard to the diversity and inclusiveness of panels of subject matter experts that we employ, from the ones that are used for the practice analysis, examination specifications, standard settings, differential item functioning panels, to all of these different panels. And we had in 2018 a review of these procedures and policies that we have put in place to ensure that we are as diverse and inclusive as possible. And we make an effort to oversample, given the homogeneous population we have, to really oversample from the categories of stakeholders that are underrepresented. The other thing that we are doing is really to take a closer look at our item writing style guide and the training we offer to item writers. So we have updated the style guide we use to make sure and train the item writers to make sure that we do not include unnecessary information that just leads to construct irrelevant variants, and it's really not useful for anyone, doesn't provide anything useful when measuring the candidate's knowledge, skills, and abilities. And we are in the process of currently doing another review with diversity and inclusiveness focus to it, to make sure that we use the appropriate language. And the D&I task force is directly involved in this new effort. And also, in addition to the implicit bias training for the staff, we added for the paid contractors for item writing, bias training and sexual harassment training for everyone. The other thing that I want to mention is changes to how we process special accommodations. Sometimes we think diversity and inclusiveness in terms of sex, race, age, but as Bach also mentioned, there are many different layers, many different ways in which we can see or not see, diversity and inclusiveness. And one of them was to really look at how we process requests for special accommodations, and to make it easier for candidates who may be qualifying for this to actually submit an application, and to reduce the processing time for these applications. In addition to that, we also engage in a communication campaign to make sure that candidates are aware, and that programs are aware, educational programs are aware that there are avenues for them, their students, to obtain special accommodations if they qualify for them. The other, one other thing I want to mention is that we also are looking at new testing modalities. And I believe, COVID-19 really forced a lot of certification programs to adopt live remote proctoring. But we were already exploring live remote proctoring in 2019, because we have stakeholders who live in very isolated areas. And in the winter of 2019, we actually had a team who traveled to Alaska to explore ways in which we can reach those individuals, because they do need EMS providers, but it was very difficult for them to get to testing centers. So in 2020, when the pandemic started, we were better positioned maybe than others because we already had some of the groundwork done, and we were able to implement live remote proctoring for 2 of our examinations. And as others probably are doing, we are monitoring our pass rates, looking at how our items perform, in order to make sure that we do not have any unusual things, nothing unusual happening, and there's no any differential functioning by various groups and categories. And finally, the things I want to mention is that we are trying to move beyond multiple choice and look for our examinations to other types of items, technology enhanced items, especially that we are in the process of revising our advanced life support examinations, and move away from a psychomotor examination, the physical portion, and adopt a new examination that requires different types of items, more with a higher fidelity to what exactly providers are doing in the field. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we're going to move to Buck.
All right. Well, so as I mentioned before, we approach this, since we don't work for any one profession, we work for a whole bunch of professions. We approach it as in terms of bias across the board. And this is our definition. It's anything that consciously or subconsciously favors, is for or against any candidate in any component of the process that is not essential for the knowledge, skill, and ability of being competent. Now that means that goes to things such as access, which Mihaiela just mentioned about, do people have the ability to get to the test, or is the test available to them? Economics, all of these kinds of things are things that prevent people from demonstrating the knowledge and skill. Language is a big factor. We're very, very cognizant of what you would call corporate speak or clubby speak. You know, the language is used in a certain part of the profession. In the higher echelons of the profession, they speak a certain way, they use certain language. That's not necessarily required to practice. Now, certainly some technical language, but a lot of times it goes beyond that. It's just the way things are phrased. So you have to watch out that the language itself doesn't bias questions for a particular group or against a particular group. And of course, you have individuals for whom English is not the native language. We have individuals for which spoken language is not the native language. Sign language is their native language. So all of these factors go into play. Next slide, please. So here's the kind of things that we look for in terms of bias. Age, appearance, we give exams that I mentioned that require people to perform, and they are videotaped and then scored by humans. So how that person appears, if they appear professional looking or not, can be a bias issue. Clothing choices, country of origin, cultural background, economic situation, I think, is a big source of bias. And this is also where minorities suffer, in that they don't have the economic access to the schools, to the programs, to get employers who can give them the experience they need. So that's a big issue. The employer that they come from. Do they come from the Mayo Clinic, or do they come from the Mayo Clinic? The Mayo Clinic is a one-person hospital or a practice in southwestern US, and the Mayo Clinic, of course, has got thousands of practitioners with all kinds of equipment. Ethnicity, gender, graphic skills. We've given tests that require people to draw, and there's a lot of bias in graphic skills. Are they really communicating, or is it a style issue? You got to watch out for. Language skills. A big one we look for is situational bias. Is your situation, where you come from, where you practice, the exposure you've had that's not part of the profession, something that is biasing the questions for or against you? Skin tone, parental situation. Interestingly enough, in interpreters for the deaf, if your parents were deaf, that's an advantage, because Ezzelle was your native language and you speak it more fluently than English. So there's a background there that comes into play. That's a positive bias, but we have to still watch out for it. Physical attributes, location, race, religion, et cetera, et cetera. Next slide, please. So how do you fight back against these things? Well, first of all, it starts with test content. What is the test covered? How do you define the profession? Don't define it by getting an elite group of subject matter experts together, what we used to call a bunch of good old boys sitting around a table. That's not how you define a profession. You have to go out, you have to seek out the various different aspects of the profession, how it's practiced in different places, and you have to design a test that really covers all of those situations. How the test is formatted, its length, how it's delivered, its the access to that are all parts of the issue. How the candidate responds. The test itself, testing itself is artificial, and we don't want the artificial aspects of testing to get in the way of us measuring the individual's ability. So we don't want things like, I had access to some very high-paid people who helped me prepare for the test, and that gave me an edge. We want to make sure we don't have those kinds of things factoring in. Scoring. What does competence mean? In a lot of these cases, there's a tendency in professions to try to raise the bar, to try to make it a more elite profession. And in doing so, what they're doing is really barring the lower level people, the people that haven't had the opportunity, from entering the profession. So we don't want it to be an unreasonable expectation of competence. And then how you go about scoring, whether it's automated, because even though it's a computer doing the scoring, a human had to sit down and decide what the correct answer was, and therefore put that into the scoring system, or human scoring, where you have people actually viewing other people and you have to take specific actions to try to make sure that all of those factors I talked about before are not influencing the scoring. So we do things like we create situations where somebody who doesn't look the part actually is competent, and we use those as training samples. And conversely, someone who looks the part, who looks very professional, who looks like they would do a good job, is really not competent. So we have to go in and train humans not to rely on extraneous factors that you may have learned through experience or through whatever, as being how you go about scoring people. So those are the areas that we work in to try to make sure that the test is really fair to everybody, and to try to make sure that to minimize those things that in culture, in countries, have advanced a certain population over another population. We don't want those factors to be what we're measuring when we're looking at testing.
Thank you. I think we go to Carol next.
Buck, I really like that idea of, pulling up old stereotypes, but reversing them, like countering them and using them as training materials. I think that's really important given human scoring. So for many years, there's been a desire within National Board to address the systemic racial inequalities that are apparent when we look at the population of National Board certified teachers. It doesn't even reflect the population in terms of race and ethnicity of the national population of teachers. And I can start by telling you about our actions with our request that ACS Ventures perform an evaluation of our certification program and candidate experience. And based on their actionable recommendations to help the board mitigate some of these effects of systemic racial bias, we're now not just trying, but ensuring that at least 50% of our SME committees are from minoritized populations. And we are recruiting to ensure that the diversity of our scorers meets or exceeds that of our candidates. And when you see that the board is conducting a revision of all of our certificate area standards, I believe there's 16, in the areas of diversity, equity, and inclusion, you can be sure that that committee of 12 people are representative of the diversity of the teaching profession, as well as the students and the communities that they serve. A majority of them are National Board certified teachers, and all of them are experts in child development, in fairness, equity, diversity, inclusion, and anti-racism. But honestly, I know this is about equity and assessment practices. I would say that much of our progress has been greatly impacted because teams other than assessment at the National Board had already been committed to significantly improving the support for and the retention of teachers of color. So again, there's been a strong commitment within the staff to address these harsh disparities in educational experience between white students and students of color here in America. So here on the slide, I've put some of our most notable progress has been made with the board functioning in a position of an ally to minoritized groups. As one example of allyship, the board has partnered with stakeholders such as the Network of Accomplished Minoritized Educators and the Latinx Education Collaborative. And together we've launched a mentor program that matches BIPOC candidates to BIPOC MBCTs to mentor candidates through the journey of National Board certification. And these organizations, they have leaders whom National Board works with to support advocacy efforts, to participate in webinars, to support candidates, to represent National Board at conferences. As a second example, the National Board strives to be an ally to the teaching profession as a whole. And in so, we funded and started delivering the March to the Future series for Mississippi MBCTs. And in this series, 100% of the presenters are teachers and community leaders of color. And as a third example, I've put down examples of how the staff at the board places a high value on removing barriers for teachers whose primary language is not English. We've published our foundational document in Spanish, and we've conducted our first candidate support webinar in the Spanish language. And so as I reflect on the progress that the board has and continues to make and strives to make, I'm reminded to be guided by the words of Catherine Close, who spoke in the first webinar in this series. She's from Renaissance Learning, And she wisely encouraged testing organizations to focus on the user experience, right? That makes sense to me, because how else can I know that I'm really being an ally to minoritized groups of people if I don't ask, if I don't listen, if I don't get feedback from them? And I know that one of our audience members said in the chat, you know, let's have the white man lead these DEI efforts, right? We created the problem, we should fix it. And I definitely feel some of that. And at the same time, the white savior complex is real, and it's not the same as long-term community building. And so I feel in this process of always learning and knowing how much we want to accomplish, ultimately the big question for me is, what do teachers need from national board in order for us to be an effective ally in recognizing their accomplished level of teaching?
Very, very nice. I think we're going to turn to Jared to close us out, and then we'll go to Q&A.
And so I'm going to be really quick. And what I'm going to say is everything the other panelists have said are exactly what somebody's going to tell you to do to try to remove bias from your exam, right? And I've got all the same stuff on this slide. And then what I'm going to tell you is, yeah, and it still doesn't always work, right? Like, you just got to be honest, right? So we've had all this stuff, diverse groups, we've done scholarships, we've been doing training in different languages. Yep, and it doesn't always work. And so I will tell you, this is my challenge to all of you on this webinar, is have an honest and really hard conversation where you debate equality versus equity. Because what I have found in the assessment world in my 13 years, we all love equality. We love to treat everybody the same and score everything the same. And yes, you can get a testing accommodation, and it's built on 7 layers of policies. And it's all about trying to make everything super equal. But the reality is, so great, I can defend my exam for hours and hours if you want to go there. But if you look at the end result is that there still is a disparate impact across the population of people that want to get a license to practice architecture. And so here's what we're really doing for the future, right? So yes, it needs to be a completely new inclusive design process. You have to be willing to rethink your entire process, which means, yeah, maybe the exam needs to go away, right? Like, I'm going to say that maybe the exam needs to go away. You need to have honest conversations about the credential's purpose. Buck was spot on when he said, man, like, architects love to talk about how smart architects are and how every other architect should be just as smart. I hate those conversations because they don't actually address the public. What I care about is if any of you on this webinar hire an architect, that you get a competent person that does a good job. That's what matters, not what other architects think about that architect. We use a statement inside of our organization all the time. It's rigor for a reason. Yes, there will be rigor in our process to earn a license, but what's the reason behind it? And if you can't point to a really good reason, get rid of it. And then the last thing is embrace those alternative paths. One thing I will tell you is, I told you, yeah, people come out of school and the diversity coming out of the NAB degree is very similar to the US population. That's great. But you know where people are? We're losing people on the path to licensure in our profession because we have an experience requirement, right? First, we lose them because 1, they honestly just can't afford to go to school. 2, we lose more people because they get into the workforce and they're like, it sucks being in this profession. Because if they don't feel included in the profession, why would they ever want to get the license, right? The people who would go that far are the people who are going to like put up with it to try to change it. And you have to then really highlight those people for what they're doing. So this is not easy. This is going to be hard work, and we all need to challenge ourselves. And when we, in this assessment world, like, this equality is our standard is a driving force for us to have to overcome. So that's where I'm going to conclude. I'm not going to give any answers except challenge you to have those really hard conversations inside your organization.
Thanks, Jared, and thanks to all of our presenters for your answers on that question. I heard some things that really kind of were thematic a little bit in the idea of tough conversations and more conversations. And I think the contagious conversations, just this idea to keep talking and not assume that maybe we have the tools in our toolkit, but think what kind of tools do we need, and rethinking, different aspects of the design and different ways that we can think about the individual who may be interested in this particular profession. So I want to, again, thank everyone for those great insights. We've gotten some great questions in the chat, so we're going to try to circle back and start on those. I believe the first one was for Mihaiela. There was a question about, in Ohio, how high school students are required, or is it required or encouraged to get a credential as they're leaving high school? And there was a question of, is this encouraging more individuals to seek your profession, as EMT was one of those options?
Sure, and thank you, Cara, for asking the question. I actually communicate behind the scenes with her.
Okay.
I do not have top of my head these numbers to know whether that actually makes a difference. But that is something that I will take back to my team and actually look into that and see whether in other states where there may be such requirements, we may see some differences. But I really don't have an answer to that right now. Thank you, though, for the suggestion and question.
That was a great question. I think several of you mentioned kind of this idea of it being connecting to the question of a pipeline. Are individuals from different backgrounds interested in the profession? Are they going to start pursuing it? And what can different groups do to encourage that? I think there was a similar question. The next one was about first generation. I'm looking at the exact. Yeah, so the question was, can you all speak to what may be done to make considerations to first generation college or university attendees, since this is often confounded with the aspects of diversity we are discussing? The examinees are likely to have experienced high stakes testing, but the experience is that they do not quite appreciate credentials. So I'll open this up to see if one of our speakers would like to start with this.
I can start. So that is a very interesting question. But I would say is that for the National Registry, for the EMS providers, the requirement to sit for the examination is just the completion of a EMS program at their level. So that varies, and the minimum requirement level of education is actually high school. So overall, across all levels, we have only about a quarter of the candidates who actually have a bachelor's degree. Most of them have high school, GED, or associate degree. So, but that is a very interesting question and something to think about. Thank you.
And I will add, I mean, in architecture, it's interesting looking at the history. In about the 1980s, there was a big push to you should have this NAV degree, and state licensing boards started making it a requirement. Like, if you don't have a NAV degree, you don't get a license. Like, it's a non-starter. The trend has actually been changing over the last few years to the point where it's like we do have some jurisdictions that never adopted an education requirement in that regard, and you can still earn a license through additional experience. It's an option. I will tell you though, it's a very small option, like that very few people take advantage of it. The vast majority of our licensees are people that have come through the NAV degree. And I will say, unfortunately, it has perpetuated a little bit of the club mentality. Because boy, once everybody goes to school and loves to sit in studio for 5 or 6 years, it becomes part of that conversation about, well, where did you go to school and what'd you do in studio? And so it can be even harder when you have alternative paths if they're not truly viewed as equal alternative paths. And so there's an out. And I will say, even on our board of directors, at the last board meeting I was at in January, this debate happened in front of me between a NAB graduate basically stating that if you don't have a NAB degree, I just don't think you're ever going to be a really good architect. So it's really hard to overcome this education bias that a lot of people have.
For the national board, I do know that of those candidates who complete the certification program, about 50% of them are first generation college students. But I appreciate you asking that question, because that could definitely be something to look into more as we consider awareness efforts. Thank you.
Let me just also agree with Jared as to the overemphasis, in my opinion, on certain paths. You have to follow this path to become a professional in this profession. And if you get off the path that I did and everyone else did and all that stuff, you shouldn't be allowed. And frankly, I think it's dated. I think that with the onset of multiple educational opportunities on the internet and other things, that education should no longer be this traditional, I go away to college for a certain period of time and then I come back and that's the only thing I can do, because that stops a lot of people from even getting into the profession. So I think as organizations, as we look at requirements, we should be much more open-minded and think of education not as a 4, 5, 6 year track, whatever it is, but look at it as an ongoing thing. And that we should look at multiple avenues for it. Our job as testing people is to decide not how the person got there, but what skills they have when they arrive at our test, basically.
Great, thanks. Another question I had jotted down about, someone had asked, is your organization including people with disabilities in your DEI efforts? Several of you spoke about accommodations, but I'll welcome any feedback there.
Please. Carol, do you want to go first?
I was going to say that for the teaching profession, there's been a big emphasis at the national board on including subject matter experts that are neurodiverse or non-binary, because that's characteristics that are becoming more prominent or coming out, so to speak, more in student populations.
And I would add to what Carol said that we are also working on becoming even more inclusive. And we, on the D&I task force, we have an intern who identifies, as such, and we have staff, on the registry, and we are trying to be more inclusive at that. And we are currently actually undergoing a revision of how we ask questions about demographics on our profiles when candidates have to come. Anyone has to create an account on the National Registry website to make sure that we are sensitive to the way we ask the questions, and to not ask them questions that we gather information that we may not use. We have to, as Jared was saying, if you do something, then have a goal and have a purpose. So we are trying to make sure that we are not just asking things for the sake of asking them. And we have a specific goal on how we're going to use that information.
So I will say in architecture, and I know that was one of the things called out, we do obviously care about disability, and we design for disability, and it is a thing. Admittedly, when I look back historically, we have not properly represented, I think, the disabled population inside of our exam development efforts or some of our other program committees. I will also caution that I can clearly remember, though, in a somewhat recent time frame, where we did have a gentleman that, he was in a wheelchair, and it turned into well, make sure he looks at every question related to, to accessibility. And it's wait a minute, that's not who he is. He's not the architect that only thinks about this. He's an architect like everybody else. He can work on any other question because he's an architect. And so there's also this caution I will put out that it's oh, just because somebody is this, they get stereotyped the other way, which is we can honestly start stereotyping this. Well, we better make sure they answer all these questions. No, that's not what this is about. He has an equal voice, just like everybody else does in the conversation. So I think it's good to think about it. I also think it's be careful in how you do it, that it doesn't turn into and you only get to, or we really want you to think about all this stuff.
And let me just add a little bit on that. Interestingly enough, we do an examination that everybody is deaf. All of the item writers are deaf. All of the committees are deaf. All of the candidates are deaf. But you still, even though that's the premise going in, you still have to be concerned with other factors, such as the physical ability to produce sign language. Do you have a problem with one of your hands or one of your arms or something else that would prevent you or minimize your ability to do that? So it's a very interesting world, because it's a world where I'm the outside. I'm the stranger, that the only one that doesn't do sign language in that examination program. And it puts you in a different perspective, and you can understand perhaps how other people might feel.
Thank you. These are just fascinating discussions, and it highlights why credentialing exams are so complex, and the issues at hand we're dealing with are so complex. We have some really, really good questions coming in too. Let's address the question Debbie was raising by our panelists around the construct, right? With credentialing exams, one of the things that we do is to define that construct through JTA or a variety of different things. But are there things in the construct definition process that are non-negotiable? Who wants to go first?
I think everything's negotiable, isn't it? Like, why would you study it if you're not actually trying to question whether it should be there or not? Okay, I guess that's my reaction.
Well, I do think there's one comment earlier in the chat where they talk about, well, to start with architecture, when you build the building, it should not collapse. But anyway.
Yes, I think that's an excellent point, right? And so but it's negotiable, honestly, that whether is that true? So, you know, maybe we should let them collapse. And then we have to think about it and go like, no, that's a bad idea. But it's negotiable, right? You at least have to ask the question. And some of the answers are really obvious. But it doesn't mean you should just look past them, because then it starts to say things like, well, you know, education, of course, you got to have that too, right? So it gets pretty easy to throw things in the bucket. Just challenge it every now and then.
Where do you stop exactly? Anyone else?
I like that. Just challenge it every once in a while, and have people, a diverse body of people challenge it. Absolutely, I think the construct of accomplished teaching is testing, because the National Board intends to make being able to respond to diverse issues, diverse students, and be inclusive in your instructional methods is, you know, getting a bit more emphasis than it already had. But I'm not sure what is no longer valuable in our standards, if anything.
I would add to what Jared and Carol said, that especially in the EMS profession, it seems like everything is important and should be on a test, which obviously, well, because everything impacts the patient, and that is a really big challenge. So we always struggle with bringing it, well, we cannot test everything. We have to test really what is deemed to be more important, more relevant, what they do in practice. And part of the reason we have modified the practice analysis is that, and we wanted to add additional data points, was because for many years we, focus groups, subject matter experts, been telling us this is what is really important and this is what is really going on. And when we got the data from MCs, we discovered that's not really that often. That doesn't really happen in practice quite as often as the subject matter experts were saying that it happens, and that other things may be actually more relevant and they should be on the test, but they have been less emphasized because of a variety of the reasons. And I think that's part of the challenge of identifying what should be there, what should not be there. But I think everything is, as Jared, is up for discussion. Should we have this in there or not? And if we want to have it in there, why? Give a reason. Why is it so important that it has to be part of the test?
Fantastic. There's another very challenging question that's posted by Sarah. I'm going to read the questions since when we record this, people will not be able to see. So we have acknowledged that credentialing exams exclude a lot of people. They are a barrier to entry to professions or jobs, and yet we, the credentialing bodies, are generally not required to provide any empirical evidence that our exams actually result in improved outcomes in terms of safer, competent performance in a profession. How can we reconcile or justify this? And she's curious to hear panel's opinions. These are fascinating and challenging questions. I do not envy our panelists, but who wants to take the first shot at it?
I don't think we answer Sarah's question. She asks hard questions all the time. And so I have to agree with Sarah. I totally agree, which I do a lot. I agree with Sarah on this one completely. Especially in licensure, right? Like I said, ours is a yes, no. And so if we say no to you over and over again, you are never given the opportunity to demonstrate your ability to practice architecture independently because you don't have a license. And the reality is we are falling short. I'm trying to then measure, well, what does that mean? Like, how do we know that, okay, our test says no, but yet everybody around you is like, oh, you're great. And I have all the anecdotal stories. So people are like, this person's been in the industry for 20 years. They just can't pass the test. They're a great employee. They should be licensed. It is a problem with this construct of like yes, no licensure, and that there's no measurement on the back end about the people who should have gotten licensed, but we said no.
And one thing about statistics and measurement and all that sort of thing is you have to be really careful to not just look at the surface, but try to understand what's going on beyond the surface. For example, I was responsible for the landscape architect licensing exam for a number of years. And we found that the male-female ratio taking the exam was not the same as the male-female ratio coming out of school. And the first result was that, oh, there's something wrong with the system. The system is stopping this from happening. But when you look deeper, when you start asking the people who didn't pursue the license, the credential, why didn't you do it? You had the degree, why didn't you pursue it? You find out that they don't always pursue the degree as part of the process that you think they're in. They're not always on the licensure path. In fact, a lot of these people did it because it was their interest. They were just interested in doing that. We found a higher percentage of females that never intended to pursue licensure. They didn't want to practice. They wanted to understand the profession and then go to something else. So you have to look beyond the numbers. I think a lot of times we make overly gross assumptions based on numbers, and you really have to understand the people and what their goals are. Are they really trying to do this, or do they have some other goal? And it can be very logical once you talk to people.
So I would add to that we have been asking this question: how can we find some additional data that shows the impact that we have, and whether any candidates who get their certification are actually performing well, and especially that we have received sometimes feedback from employers that the candidates were not prepared to practice. They may be missing some skills and they would like to have them. And there's like a disconnect between what the educational programs are doing and what we are testing and what the employers are looking for. So it is a very complex, linkage there. But the challenge for us was what data are we going to use in order to show that we have this impact, since there is no centralized system for us to help us get this information, since employers, some keep some records, some not, some keep different records. It's really hard to get to that information that will help us make some sound results, lead us to some sound outcomes, right? That will say, yes, we have an impact or not. But that is one question that we've been struggling with for a few years now, and we haven't given up. It's just it is one of those complications that's hard to address.
Ezzelle, do you want to comment on that, or?
I don't really have much to add to what the others have said. I was just thinking about the differences and the different uses, like a lot of what's here are licensing, and National Board is a certification program. Well, we do have research to support the effectiveness of accomplished teaching and National Board certified teachers. It's a lot of, or the candidate journey is often experienced as one of extreme professional learning as well.
This is fantastic. And I appreciate the tough questions our audiences are posing to our panelists. I have one last question, and I'm going to, well, given the time, I'm just going to ask my question. And one of the things I think it would be really good for us to do as a measurement community, for NCME and the larger measurement community, is just put our heads together and think about ways that we can do together to address various things, instead of we all individually within our own business vertical to figure out what we need to do. So I wanted to pose this question to the panelists around what you think the larger measurement community and NCME in particular can help put together or help advance our practices with DEI in mining assessment.
I'll answer first, because right now I'm really in a space of learning, right? Learning about racism, learning about what it takes to be anti-racist. And I think without that understanding, I personally would probably not head in the right direction. So I'm going to start with, what it means to be an ally, find out what that means, and not just to be an ally to some, but to be an ally to all, because sooner or later, we're all going to need to have an ally ourselves.
I guess my response to that question would be, we as a testing community can't always just rely on what's simple for us. Multiple choice is a simple way of doing things. Is it the best way of doing things? Is it the best way for everyone, for every skill? I don't think so. But it's so much easier than all these other things. You can crank out these tests and all of that, and it's artificial. It's not real. And we have to think about our own tools, part of the problem, frankly.
So, and I guess what I would add is, I think as a community, we have to start looking across the programs, right? So it's great that we have this, panel up here and we're all coming at it a little bit differently, but how can we start to really study across the way? So that means we all need to get transparent. We all need to start sharing data, and we need to do some of that bigger data analysis, which is like, yeah, there might be some patterns happening inside of architecture, but what is going on in the teacher world, and what are the patterns there, right? And maybe it just exposes something that we just haven't thought of, because it might be a small pattern in architecture, so I'm going to be like, oh, I'm not going to focus on that. I'm going to focus on the bigger thing. But maybe there's this crossover and that's going to take all of us. Like, that's us opening up our data. That is us opening up, and being honest about what we're seeing.
So I will add to what Jared said, because I really like that idea. And it really learning from what others are doing and understanding what they are doing. But that doesn't happen unless we really communicate that we are really open to, this is what's going on. And when Jared was saying that, you know, in architecture, you have like white men being there, that has been EMS, you know, providers field for a very long time, and it's still predominantly like that. So there is potential, there is something that's going on across fields and across, you know, different credentials, and there are maybe things that if we work together, we may be able to find solutions that otherwise, if we work in our own bubbles, we may not be able to identify. So I think that would be a really great step for us moving forward. And then to what Carol said, it's a lot of learning and a lot of education. As someone who has not been born in this country, I have been learning for the past 2 decades, you know, about the race relations, about history, about how things are here, but I'm still learning, and I'm learning it since I've joined the Diversity and Inclusion Task Force at a much faster pace, but also things that I have never really thought about, you know, and it's just, it is really rewarding, but at the same time, it's very challenging, because the more you learn that you should have known or you should have done, you realize that the reality is much more complex, and that we try to simplify it a lot.
Well, great. I want to thank all of our panelists for being here today, and for our audience for sharing such great questions and thoughts in the chat. Those were fantastic. You know, I think today we had a chance to really talk about hear from these programs and hear what these conversations are like. And we are so grateful that you're willing to share these perspectives, because not only are these tough to have internal to a program, but we know a lot of programs aren't willing to share publicly what they're thinking about, what they're discussing, what questions they're asking. So this is really fantastic. I think we heard a lot of great short-term solutions or immediate solutions, where they're saying that we're looking at the diversity of our panels and we're looking at our procedures. But as I feel like as our conversation continued on, we're focusing also on bigger picture ideas, looking not just at the test, but at the entire process, education all through getting into the profession. We talked about sharing across these fields and having conversations like this, which is fantastic. And really being willing to make big change, right? And acknowledging that some of these things that we just take for granted as part of the process or the way we do things may not be the future of assessment in the credentialing space. So again, I want to thank everyone for being here and contributing, and we look forward to seeing you in 1 week for our next session.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.